This session is about cloud deployment. We will not speak only about the cloud deployment. We will compare the cloud deployment and on-premise. We have some new adopters or future adopters, and they are wondering what's the best way, what's the best approach to deploy an instant payment system. So in the panel here, we have Festus Ware from IPSL, Babuka Drame from Gumswitch, and Jonathan from Comesa. So we discuss here a few points regarding what's the best solution for different people. So I will start. The first question will be regarding how to decide between those approaches. So, and typically when we deploy a Mojaloop, we will go from a POC. Some people will skip this step. We also need a test platform. We need a production platform. And those environments can give some variations in the way we decide, the strategies we decide to deploy a switch. So I will ask, I will start with IPSL. IPSL is running a switch since long time, and not only switches, other services. So my first question will be for you. According to you, what are the factors to consider to decide whether to deploy on-premise or on cloud? For you, especially you are deploying a lot of things on cloud. So you can share why you decided to go for cloud. Up to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the panel. So for IPSL, when it came to considering how we were going to approach the Mojaloop deployment, we did have to look at where we were today, which was running primarily on premise, and what the cloud would offer us if we chose to go that direction. So when it came to running our POC, we sort of had to take a step back and create an adoption roadmap. Now, as part of that adoption roadmap, we split it into two main categories, where we would look at the Mojaloop platform on its own and what metrics we were focusing on. Rather, the key focus areas we were focusing on were around the core functionality, use cases of the platform, how it handles dispute resolution, performance criteria, how it gets deployed on infrastructure, and its integration and security factors. And once we were able to identify all those key areas, we then moved on to the cloud side of it. So, okay, there are multiple cloud vendors. How do we decide who we choose to deploy on? And so we also did come up with specific key focus areas that were specific to us, but I think can also be shared by others. And what we were looking at were areas around API management, the cloud infrastructure offering for these vendors, how they handle their data, or rather the tools they use to manage their data, because, as running a switch, you deal with a lot of data. And so that's a key area we were keen on looking at. Then also, because cloud has its own inherent cost element of how you operate, we did also want to think about how do you run a hybrid setup. So we're also looking at the hybrid capabilities of these cloud vendors. And two underlooked ones are usually the partner support, especially running in Africa. A lot of these cloud vendors don't have a huge footprint in the region, so usually work through partners. So we're also evaluating the kind of partners that these cloud vendors provide. And the last one is obviously upskilling your people, right? So you can import personnel overseas, or also upskill your internal people. So those two categories formed the basis of around 6 factors that drove our decision to choose cloud over on-premise. Now, the 6 main factors we were looking at were how scalable and flexible the cloud platforms are. And here, really, what we're looking at was, when we're doing our POC, one thing we wanted to do was quickly get up and running. without having to figure out too many things with our on-prem setup. So when we're doing the POC with you, Nathan, I think it took us 2-3 days to set up everything, infrastructure, the platform, and test it. And I found that pretty impressive. And so that was one key area we really wanted to focus on. Now, the next factor we really wanted to think about was the cost consideration. Now, running on-premise environments is usually a capital-intensive operation, right? So it has a very CapEx-intensive setup when you're doing the infrastructure. Now, what cloud allowed us to do was shift that model to an OpEx-based one, but allowed us to quickly experiment, get the environment up and running. But then, just as much as you're focusing on the cost, you really have to look at it from a total cost of ownership, because cloud can also get expensive. You really need to understand how the costing works. And we went looking into how we could better manage that, and we came across the FinOps Foundation, who came up with a specification called Focus, which basically stands for FinOps Open Cost and Usage Specification. It basically allows us to better track the costing and figure out how the total cost of ownership will look like. The other factor we did look at, obviously, was data sovereignty and compliance. Given that we're a national switch, we had to figure out what the regulation says about running in cloud, what are the gray areas, what do we need clarity on. And so for us, on-prem gives you control, but cloud providers are also catching up. Like in Kenya, we're seeing a lot of the new data centers opening up by cloud providers to sort of allow you to fit into these compliance requirements. And so that one is a key one for us to decide how we're going to run the cloud. Now, the other factor that we did look at also was the security posture of the cloud provider. And really here, what we're looking at is when you run on-premise, you have full control, right? When you move to cloud, it's a shared responsibility model. So you do have to change your DevSecOps practices to sort of think about how you can work within that new shared responsibility model. And so for us, part of the consideration was, how do we upskill or bring in the necessary expertise to help us to figure out how to run on a shared responsibility model. Then we did also look at the operational resilience. And really here, we're just looking at, okay, so on-premise, I know how to set up my DR, recovery, HA setups. How will that look like in the cloud with a switch? There are many factors you have to think about when you're trying to build up a proper HA setup and do DR for business continuity planning. Now, finally, the final factor we did look at was, so one thing cloud does give you is access to advanced services. And what I mean by advanced services is, if tomorrow the vendor brings in a new AI tool, on-premise, that will have a lot of investment trying to figure out how to get that running on-premise. But on cloud, it's a matter of just figuring out what the service does, how it works, and you'll quickly be able to deploy it. And so those really did form the 6 factors that we considered based off of the Mojaloop criteria and the cloud criteria that we focused on.
Very good. Thank you very much. We have a very detailed explanation of how you got to decide to go with the cloud. My second question will go to Babuka. You are running switches since a long time, and most of your services are running on premise. So can you explain how you decided to go for on premise, and what were the considerations that brought you to this decision?
Very much. So the topic about cloud deployments and on-premise deployment is actually a very hot topic in the Gambia right now, and the debate is still going on. In fact, when this new government came in, they set up a ministry called Ministry of Digital Economy, and also set up an agency called Gambia Information Communication Technology Agency, which is responsible of driving all the digital and information communication aspirations of the government. And they're really the ones trying to come up with policies surrounding deployments. But at GAMSwitch, as you mentioned, all our deployments since inception have been on-premise. One of the key topics that is usually mentioned when talking about deployments is sovereignty, data sovereignty, security, and so on. But most of the times when it is brought up, especially recently, I do tell them that I believe it is very important to talk about privacy, sovereignty, security, but have we really defined what sovereignty means to us? Because there are other factors that we also need to look at, and most of the time it is overlooked. Availability of the systems, scalability, flexibility, and so on. And in the Gambia, I would say each jurisdiction has its own peculiarities. Our experiences are different. Perhaps in Kenya, it's easier to set up an on-premise data center versus the Gambia. Let me even just ask this question to my counterpart here in Kenya. If you wanted to procure a server in Kenya, a high-spec server, how long would it take you?
Typically, it will take you anywhere from a month to 3 months.
Exactly. So it's almost similar in the Gambia, but do you have vendors locally that provide that?
We do have them, but they do end up importing the hardware.
So it's almost the same experience in our case as well. And those are the things that you also need to consider when deciding whether you need to go in for cloud and on-premise deployments. But right now, as I said, in the Gambia, we are doing on-prem. And the main reason why we did so was because of data sovereignty. It was a decision by the central bank, because GamSwitch is affiliated to the Central Bank of the Gambia, that we need to protect our data. Everything needs to be housed locally. And that is why we went on to do a local deployment. But we are still debating, should we have a hybrid system, or should we really move some of our less critical systems to the cloud? Because if you're looking at cost, setting up a data center is more expensive. But again, at times, cloud deployments can be expensive depending on how we've also set it up and looking at long-term cost. But currently, all our systems are locally deployed.
Thank you very much. This is another point of view, another environment that led to another decision. So depending on the situation, you may reach out to a different conclusion. The next question will be for Dr. Jonathan. We saw this morning that you had very good progress with Mojaloop deployment, and you are testing your system now, and you went for a different solution. So I'll let you explain your solution and explain the issues you have faced with the decision with the method of deployment you have opted for.
Thank you very much, Nathan. So ideally, in our context, we are looking at two aspects. So the first one is on, we will deploy in the cloud. I think specifically we're looking at AWS as the main services where they'll be provided from, but also because of the regulatory requirements in some jurisdictions, we're also going to go on premise for the redundancy part. And in terms of our rationale, there were several reasons. So I will take it up from my colleague from Kenya on the advanced services. So that's also one of the key aspects. So we are looking at more functionality in terms of like issues. For instance, you looked at there are more services, more features from infrastructure technologies, like for instance, computing, storage, database. And this also leads to even emerging services, be it machine learning or artificial intelligence or Internet of Things. So in our context, for the COMESA project, when it comes to the fraud management, we are looking at interfacing the platform with the fraud management. And one key aspect that we are looking at is the fraud detection using artificial intelligence. So that functionality part is also one of the aspects that led us to think of the cloud as the main component. Secondly is the issue to do with high performance as well as high reliability. And this is due to the fact that when you look at the cloud, you're talking about distributed infrastructure, whereby probably if one data center in one location is down, obviously the data center in another location is going to be up. And this also brings me to the point, I think, which Great Book Elizabeth was talking about when he was looking at the level 1 principles in as far as usefulness of the projects are concerned, and this is to do with reliability. The third aspect, of course, the others have already been highlighted. So we had to consider issues like security. So we are talking of a deep set of cloud security tools. And also, even in our context, we're saying this project started way back. We want to have it on the market as soon as possible. So it's also one of the quicker ways in as far as how fast do we go to the market. So we felt also having cloud as the main platform is the faster route to the market. So I think other points have been said, but in the interest of time, maybe I can stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So another approach. So I think you have combined both solutions, on-premise and cloud, to overcome regulatory requirements and technical requirements. This is very interesting. So the next point, I would like you, Kenya and Gambia, to share more about the issues you have faced. Some people will go for cloud, some will go for on-premise. I would like you to share which issue you have faced and let them know they must prepare for it if they go for your specific solution. So I will start with Festus. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So when it came to looking at the challenges in the cloud, today we are an early adopter. We've primarily been running on-premise, and so we're beginning to understand what it'll take to run in the cloud. And I think what we've seen so far were 4 main challenges that we saw what a good learning point for us. The main one, the first one that really became an issue was integration complexity. So you're moving to cloud, you have to figure out how to connect to these legacy banking systems, local payment networks. And it becomes a huge challenge trying to figure out how to get those working, because a lot of these payment systems don't understand cloud. So they don't build them to be cloud native. And when you go to cloud, you have to think about how do I bridge the gap to allow you to take advantage of the cloud. So that was a major challenge, integration complexity. Second one was the latency it introduced. Now, because you're moving away from your on-premise, you're going to a region, let's say in Ireland, and you're in Kenya, and there's no region closer to you, you do introduce latency into the system. And instant payment systems are very sensitive to latency. And so what we started thinking about is a small increase in milliseconds can affect how many transactions you can do in an hour. And that also has a trickle-down effect on your earnings, right? Because you make money off the transaction. So that was another challenge we had to figure out. And it's good to see cloud vendors trying to bridge the gap by coming into your countries, because that now can help us handle the latency issue. Now, third item was now regulatory hurdles, right? Because there's no running away from this. Now, when it came to this challenge, the way we were looking at it was the lack of control you give away to the cloud vendor, because it's now managed. And it becomes a bit harder to implement some of those the policies, things like PCI DSS, GDPR, and any other data residency considerations. So it becomes a challenge trying to figure out how you can now enforce those policies and compliance regulations on cloud. And that became something we had to figure out the hard way. And then the last one, obviously, was the skill gap, but this skill gap and change management. And this one comes around people mindset, trying to get your organization to adopt, and even just the ecosystem that you're operating in to drive the adoption into cloud. And what we saw was we needed to figure out how to win the minds of our people and help drive the cloud adoption journey. So I think that sums up the main challenges we had.
Thank you very much. I didn't see you insisting on the cost. I know a lot of people are afraid of the cost of the cloud. how do you manage to control your cost on the cloud?
So early on, we did make the decision to take a hybrid approach because we saw it's the most feasible way for us to operate both on cloud and on-prem to manage our cost footprints and also deal with regulatory compliance. So for us, a hybrid became the solution where we, like my colleague said, you choose which services you get to run in the cloud based on their use cases for the service. So if it's a critical service, you can keep that on premise. And anything that's not critical, you move to the cloud. That way you can experiment and see how that cost dimension looks like. But in my earlier point, I spoke about FinOps, right? So it does require an investment in learning, training FinOps practitioners to understand how to better understand your total cost of ownership in the cloud, because that's where really it's a staggering point for most people when it comes to adoption. So that's how I'd look to bridge that gap when it comes to cost management.
Thank you very much. Now back to Babuka. So which issue did you face and want to share with other people regarding the on-premise so that they will get prepared for this?
All right, thank you very much. So even though we are running an on-premise deployment, we've had experience with integrating to systems that are on the cloud. And there have been challenges with the integration, at times even as minute as setting up VPN connections, because perhaps some of them have legacy systems running and so on. And on top of that, which even brings me to my next point, capacity of the resources you have to maintain these deployments, whether it's both local or on-premise. I'm speaking from a Gambian context purely. And in the Gambia, I know of a data center in the Gambia that has reached end of life. The whole data center has reached end of life for about 5 years. How did that happen? It's because of how it was set up in the first place. These were funds, external funds to sponsor this deployment of that data center. And the funds were just for initial deployment, but there was no continuity plan. So the data center has been operating for quite a while, and then there was the need to upgrade. How do you do that? There's no funds to do that. So it's still there, not being upgraded. And that's a challenge because now no one wants to use that data center anymore because the systems are old and they don't really trust using it. So those are some of the things that you need to look at. And I believe the decision to either go for cloud or on-premise, it doesn't have a one-size-fits-all answer. You always need to look at your realities, where you are, and then make a decision based on that.
Thank you very much. To Dr. Jonathan, I'd like you to respond to the same question, the issues you have faced during your journey, and what you want to share with people so that they will prepare for.
All right, thank you. In our context, since we are not yet live, but we are yet to go live. However, I would say that we've done a comprehensive risk management framework whereby we are also trying to assess probably what sort of risks can we face. So ideally also, I think my colleagues have already mentioned some of the aspects, but maybe just to begin with, I think one aspect could be maybe the issue of vendor lock-in, whereby you find ourselves being vendor locked in. So maybe in case something happens, sometimes it's difficult to get out of it. So that could be one of the possible aspects. But also secondly, the other issue is to do with a limited control as well as flexibility, maybe when it comes to do configurations or other system changes and the like. So that's also another limitation. And again, also, I think my colleague from Kenya talked about latency issues. So probably the fact that it's in the cloud and also it depends on internet. And in most African countries, you find that maybe internet is not dependable, it's not 100% reliable. So also those latency issues could play a role. But again, also he mentioned about regulatory aspects, so maybe the compliance of the cloud, but also we cannot maybe underrate the issue of attacks. Today, there are so many cyber attacks. So those are also some of the things that we are trying to look at that might even affect the performance of our platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we have explored the main subject of this panel. I would like to give you the opportunity to give each one of you the top advice you want to give to future adopters. One advice per person, please. Before you, if someone have a question, you can prepare. After the advices, you can ask your questions.
So I think from people who are considering adopting Mojaloop, I think what I can say is a key area that you should consider is really thinking about your adoption roadmap, because that really defines for you how your adoption is going to look like, right? And for us, we really spent a lot of time initially trying to define what that roadmap will look like for us. And that really helped bring clarity when it came to pulling the trigger to decide, okay, this is the direction we're going to take with Mojaloop. This is the direction we're going to take with cloud. And when it comes to engaging the partners and ecosystem that we're operating in, it does help define how you can begin to having those conversations early enough. So, yeah.
Thank you. So,
Yeah, so I think I'll just second what my colleague said about, sorry, having an adoption roadmap, but on top of that, also having a deployment strategy and really critically thinking of what use cases are you looking at, and also how do you want to automate your deployments, because that's also critical. He did mention it earlier that usually cloud providers have more tools readily available. So it all comes down to one thing anyway. It's up to you. You need to make the decision, but just look at your jurisdiction, what's available there, what are your main challenges, and then come up with that decision whether you need to go to cloud or on-prem.
From my context, I would say that I think the most important thing is to do research, do a proper cost benefit analysis to see probably what sort of challenges can you foresee, but also what are the service providers providing, what their business model like, what is their pricing model like. So by having such information, you'll be able to make a good decision as probably, let's say if you're going on the cloud, which service provider do you need to go to. So research is very important. Proper cost benefit analysis is very important. So that's my advice and my last word. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. So if we have some questions, okay, the time, right? Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for the time.
All right, thank you so much. For the benefit of the French speakers in the room, there was a burning question that I think is targeted at Michael Richards. Could we have that question now? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the first presentation. It was very insightful. There are two questions that I would like you to shed light on. The first one has to do with the Mojaloop solution in terms of TPS. How flexible is it when it comes to transactions per second, managing transactions per second, or the volume? Now, the second question has to do with, there are some national switches that host some banks or financial institutions. Now, the question is that, is there any provision in the Mojaloop solution that allows for certain financial institutions to be hosted? And if so, is there any mobile applications or maybe light mobile application that this financial institution can be supported with? So for example, if I say be supported with, it has to do with the mobile application, like for microfinances or certain microfinances, or some of the banks that do not have at all mobile application, but they want to be part of the switch, like we have in some countries in West Africa. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'm going to answer the first question about performance by passing it over to our chief engineer, Professor James Bush.
Thank you, Michael. I think there's two parts to that question. One is how flexible is the platform, and two, what is the maximum level of performance we can expect? What I can tell you is that a small test deployment, which is frequently done by members of the Mojaloop community, can be done on quite a small hardware profile, may achieve tens or hundreds of transactions per second, enough for you to develop your services around Mojaloop. Production quality deployments and performance test environments running on hardware, typical mid-level server hardware, anything between 3 and 4 servers, we've been able to achieve up to 1,000 transfers per second through that hardware. We do have ambitions to go higher. And we have some projects in progress to unlock, hopefully, an order of magnitude performance improvement beyond that. And they'll be coming in the next 6 months or so. But the figure of 1,000 TPS, we set ourselves that as a target about 18 months ago, and we achieved that probably 6 months ago. Some of the recent deployers in their performance and stress testing have had very good results. I'm not sure if they'd be comfortable with me sharing the numbers that they've mentioned to me, but some of the test deployments we're seeing at the moment that haven't really been performance tuned yet in production quality infrastructure are achieving 300 plus TPS currently. So there are people in the room who have personally achieved 1,000 TPS on their on-premise deployments.
So a quick follow-up on this one, because achieving TPS is not terribly hard. The key thing is really latency. And I'm sure you have a good story to tell there as well.
Yes, I'll tell you the story. So the targets we set ourselves aren't only around throughput, they are around latency as well. So one of the what we call our invariants, one of our key design principles, targets, I think, what did we say? 99% of those transfers taking less than 1 second to clear through the system. That's the target that we have, and we're currently achieving that target.
Maybe a bold question, but knowing some of the targets in US, UK, etc., when are you aiming at, let's say, 200 to 500 milliseconds through the switch?
Yeah, that's achievable. We haven't really tuned a great deal yet. We don't know what's achievable on some of the fully scaled out production hardware, because we're only just seeing the scale of deployments now in the wild.
Yeah. And just as an aside, people do ask for very large TPS, but I do remember when we've implemented a mid-sized Nordic country, they asked for 500 TPS. They were running in production at 35 TPS or something like that.
Yes.
So there is that.
It's about lumpy demand, of course. Being able to handle 1,000 TPS means we can deal with peaks in traffic, even though the average is likely to be way, way lower for the foreseeable future. Yes.
Exactly.
Thank you. Back to Michael.
Sorry, I was just going to add to that, of course, in a Mojaloop system, load is related only to off-us transactions, i.e. only to transactions where the two parties are in different DFSPs. All of the transactions where the parties on the same DFSP don't appear through the Mojaloop system, though you can configure a Mojaloop system to process on-us transactions as well. So I think this is probably where Gene's disparity, or part of where Gene's disparity comes from. If you look at overall transactions through the system, they will be overall transactions in a market, they will be very, very much higher than the transactions that are going through the Mojaloop switch, because you need to subtract from that all of the transactions which are within a single institution. If people are happy with that answer, yeah, I'll move on to the second one. So Mojaloop is a system which connects DFSPs together. We don't have any software of our own that provides anything like a core banking system. But what we do have is a set of connections with a system called MIFOS, which is an open source core banking system which anybody can download and install to support their own core banking activities. And in cases where a DFSP doesn't have its own core banking system, for instance, small informal organizations, they can download a copy of MIFOS and use that to run their core banking activities. And there are existing connectors which will connect a MIFOS system through to a Mojaloop system, so they can join in that way. I know that other deployers of systems have provided their own core banking systems for very small institutions, and there is no reason why people shouldn't do that. As I say, the Mojaloop system connects core banking systems together, whatever kind of core banking system they are, as long as they can meet the requirements of the Mojaloop system. We don't care what's happening at the back of that. Does that answer your question, or have I mistaken it?
Thank you, Simeon. I just wanted to take a few minutes. I'll try to be very quick to bring us back to some information that we were shown in some of the sessions during the day, particularly relating to cross-border and inter-scheme, FX, foreign exchange, ISO 20022, and on-premises deployments enabled by our infrastructure as code. Let's not underestimate the significance of what we've seen here. Those demonstrations were done in a production-like staging environment. These demonstrations represent the culmination of many years of very hard work by numerous members of the community, a very large number of contributors. As Michael mentioned, some of this thinking began over 10 years ago. The architects, the designs have been discussed and iterated and reviewed many, many times. But where we find ourselves now, having very close to live implementation, these features being available in the open source GitHub repositories for our adopters to download and start experimenting with. The visionary people implementing real deployments right now with these features, everybody involved in getting us to this point, the Mojaloop Foundation would like to give a big shout out and a huge thank you to everybody who's contributed their time and effort to get us to this point. That includes everybody who's been involved in the decision-making, the design, the review, the product managers who've been writing the stories, the scrum masters who've been unblocking the teams every day, the engineers writing the code, the QA and test engineers who've been making sure we ship a quality product. Everybody involved in this, thank you. Thank you. You've made such a significant such a significant contribution, the amount of value that's been released into the Mojaloop community from multiple work streams, all collaborating to get us to this point. It's a really, really great thing. I wanted to make sure we don't miss the significance of that. Thank you very much, guys.